Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into a topic you guys have been asking about. Wrongful convictions.
Yeah, it's a tough one, but a really important one.
Absolutely. And we've got a ton of research to dig into, academic journals, government reports, even some firsthand accounts.
We're going for that 360-degree view.
Exactly. And, a lot of you have requested that we don't just focus on the how these miscarriages of justice happen. You want to know about the impact on the people who've lived through it.
Right, the human cost.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're going to explore that as well.
And it's not just a few isolated cases. We're talking potentially thousands of people affected every year.
Thousands, seriously.
Yeah, thousands. The Innocence Project, just using DNA evidence, has helped exonerate over 375 people in the U.S.
Okay, but I mean, DNA evidence isn't always available, right?
Right, it's only in a small percentage of cases. So that number, 375, it's probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow, that's pretty disturbing.
Yeah. Some studies suggest the actual rate of wrongful convictions could be way higher than we realize.
So where do we even begin? What causes these wrongful convictions in the first place?
Well, researchers have pinpointed 6 main contributing factors.
6. Okay, lay them on me.
So we've got eyewitness misidentification,
Okay, that makes sense.
then faulty forensic analysis,
Right.
false confessions, which, might sound surprising.
Yeah, why would anyone confess to a crime they didn't commit?
Well, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
We've also got perjury and false accusations.
Right, so people straight up lying.
Yep. And then misconduct by police, prosecutors, or judges.
Yikes.
And finally, inadequate defense strategies.
So like a lawyer not doing their job properly.
Yeah, sometimes, but it can be more complicated than that, too.
Okay, so 6 main factors, and these can all kind of intertwine, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. It's rarely just one thing that goes wrong.
Right, right. Okay, so let's break these down, starting with eyewitness misidentification. It's crazy to think that something like remembering a face could have such huge consequences.
Yeah, we tend to think of our memories as these perfect recordings.
Yeah, like a video camera.
Exactly. But they're actually really fragile, especially when you're stressed.
No, I can see that.
There's this thing called the weapon focus effect. Basically, a witness under duress will hyper-focus on the weapon, if there is one, and miss other crucial details.
So it's like their brain prioritizes the immediate threat.
Exactly.
Is that what happened in that case? Kirk Bloodsworth, he was on death row, right?
Yeah, Kirk Bloodsworth. His case is a prime example of how eyewitness misidentification can go wrong. Spent years behind bars based on faulty eyewitness accounts.
And he was innocent the whole time.
It wasn't until DNA evidence came along that they realized they had the wrong guy.
Wow. So those lost years, they're just gone.
Gone. And it's a powerful reminder that even well-intentioned witnesses, they can make mistakes with serious consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to false confessions. This one's a little harder for me to grasp. Like, why would anyone confess to something they didn't do?
It happens more often than you'd think, especially with, more vulnerable people.
Okay, I guess I can see that.
Take Lorenzo Montoya, for example. 14-year-old kid, interrogated under intense pressure,
Okay.
and he confessed.
Even though he was innocent.
Yep. Some interrogation techniques, they're specifically designed to get confessions, even if it means pushing ethical boundaries.
Pushing ethical boundaries, that sounds shady.
Yeah. One technique, called the Reed technique, is pretty controversial.
The Reed technique. Okay, what's that all about?
It's a multi-step process, uses a combo of psychological manipulation and persuasion. Some people say it's a good way to get confessions from guilty parties, but others argue it can lead to false confessions, especially with people who are young, easily intimidated, or have intellectual disabilities.
So it's less about physical force and more about, like, mind games.
Exactly. And in Lorenzo Montoya's case, it led to him spending 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 14 years. His entire adolescence.
That's awful.
And again, DNA evidence later proved his innocence.
This is all pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about official misconduct. It seems like this goes beyond a few bad apples, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. We're talking systemic issues here. Investigators sometimes prioritize getting a conviction over finding the truth.
That's scary.
The Timothy Masters case in Colorado, that's a perfect example. Exculpatory evidence that could have proven his innocence, was deliberately concealed.
Concealed, like hidden on purpose.
Yep. And because of that, Masters was wrongfully convicted, spent 9 years in prison before the truth finally came out.
9 years. I don't even know what to say. This is really making me question our justice system.
Yeah, it raises some serious questions about accountability and safeguards.
Okay, let's move on to faulty forensic analysis. It's kind of mind-blowing that something that should be pure science is actually susceptible to human error.
Yeah, and it can have huge consequences.
Right, like in that Crystal Voss case. She was convicted of child abuse based on the shaken baby syndrome theory, right?
Exactly. And that theory, well, it's been pretty much debunked now.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. What's
Yeah.
wrong with it?
Well, for a long time, shaken baby syndrome was widely accepted as a diagnosis for certain infant injuries. But over time, research started to show that a lot of those symptoms could actually be caused by other things.
So she was convicted based on a theory that's basically wrong.
Pretty much. It just highlights how important it is to constantly scrutinize and update forensic science. What we think is fact today might turn out to be flawed tomorrow, and people's lives are on the line.
This is all so disturbing.
Mhm.
It's like the line between justice and injustice is thinner than we think. Okay, we still have a couple more factors to go, right? Perjury and inadequate defense.
Right. Perjury is when witnesses lie under oath, and that can happen for a bunch of reasons. Maybe they have a personal grudge, maybe they're pressured by law enforcement.
Right. And what about inadequate defense?
That's when the defendant's lawyer just isn't up to snuff. Maybe they don't have enough resources, maybe they're inexperienced, maybe they just don't do their job properly.
It seems like both of these issues really undermine the whole idea of a fair trial.
Absolutely. If you can't trust the witnesses and the defendant doesn't have a strong defense, the whole pursuit of justice falls apart.
Okay, I think I need a mental break from all this legal stuff. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the human side of this. We talked about exploring the impact of wrongful convictions on those who've experienced it.
Yeah, let's get into that. We have some firsthand accounts from a study by Dr. Catherine Campbell and Dr. Miriam Detonoff. They interviewed 5 Canadian men who were all wrongfully convicted and imprisoned.
Wow, 5 men. What did they learn from those interviews?
Well, it turns out the impact goes way beyond just the years they lost in prison.
Yeah, I bet.
These guys talked about this profound sense of loss of identity, loss of relationships, loss of faith in themselves and the world around them.
So even after they were released, it wasn't just happily ever after.
No, not at all. One man, Mark, talked about losing his family and connection with his father while he was locked up. His kids were even taken away by Child Protection Services.
Oh, man. That's just heartbreaking.
Another man, Jason, he said he felt like he'd lost his very identity. He actually said, "I lost me is what I lost. My identity, who I am, the way I viewed life."
Losing yourself, that's heavy.
Yeah. And on top of the feelings of loss, there was a lot of anger and aggression. I mean, imagine being robbed of years of your life, wrongfully accused and punished for something you didn't do. It's bound to have a huge psychological impact.
So even though they were eventually exonerated, the trauma of the experience stayed with them.
Yeah. A lot of them talked about feeling trapped by their past, like they were still imprisoned in a way, even though they were physically free.
Can you give an example of what that looked like in their lives?
Sure. Max, who was wrongfully convicted of robbery and spent 5 years in prison, followed by another 10 on parole, he said, and I quote, "When I'm asked how much time I did, I believe that I've been in prison for decades psychologically." This was decades after he was released.
It's like the experience left a permanent scar.
It did. It shows just how difficult the road to recovery can be. They have to rebuild their lives, their relationships, their sense of self, all while carrying the weight of what happened to them.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at the factors that contribute to wrongful convictions, from flawed eyewitness testimony to official misconduct, and we've started to understand the deep and lasting impact these miscarriages of justice have on people's lives.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into the complexities of seeking justice, the paths to exoneration and redress, as well as the challenges and limitations of those processes.
Looking forward to it.
Going through all these cases, there's this pattern that really jumps out at you.
Ooh, what's that?
Investigators, especially when they're under pressure to solve a case, they can get tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision.
Yeah, like imagine you're looking through a tunnel. Your focus is narrow, right? You miss what's happening on the sides.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
It's the same in investigations. They fixate on one suspect or theory, and they miss, or even ignore, evidence that contradicts it.
So they're so focused on finding the bad guy They don't see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that can lead to some serious mistakes. Like, remember the Timothy Masters case?
Yeah, the one where they thought his drawings were proof he was, like, a murderer.
Exactly. But it turned out those were just, the expressions of a teenager dealing with grief.
Right, grieving for his mother.
But the investigators, they were so convinced he was guilty, they interpreted everything he did as evidence against him.
It's like they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
That's a great way to put it. And this tendency to, like, cherry pick evidence, it's made even worse by something called confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's basically our natural tendency to favor info that confirms what we already believe, even if it's wrong.
So in a criminal investigation, confirmation bias means the investigators are looking for evidence that proves their suspect is guilty, even if there's other evidence that says otherwise.
Exactly. It creates this dangerous cycle. The more they believe someone is guilty, the more likely they are to see everything as proof of that guilt.
That's kind of scary.
It is. And then you add in incentivized witnesses, and things get even more complicated.
Oh, right, the Corey Wise Innocence Project report talked about that, right? They called it a perverse auction.
Yeah, it's messed up. Basically, you have these witnesses who are offered something, a shorter sentence, money, whatever, in exchange for testifying against someone.
So the truth is basically for sale.
In a way, yeah. And this puts huge pressure on people to cooperate, even if it means lying. Look at the Deshaun Jones case. He was accused of sexual assault solely based on the word of an incentivized witness.
And that witness later admitted to lying.
Yep, made the whole thing up. And this case also highlights the issue of plea bargaining.
Plea bargaining.
Yeah, when someone pleads guilty to a lesser charge to avoid a longer trial and potentially harsher sentence.
But wouldn't that mean innocent people are pleading guilty?
Sadly, yes. They get caught in this no-win situation, risk a longer sentence, or admit to a crime they didn't commit. Some studies say a lot of wrongful convictions involve people who took plea deals under pressure.
That's just wrong.
It is. And then there's the whole issue of inadequate defense strategies.
Right, like having a bad lawyer.
Well, it can be more than that. Sometimes it's a lack of resources. Public defenders are often overworked and underfunded.
Yeah, one of the papers we read pointed that out. It's not always intentional. Sometimes it's just a lack of resources or experience on the defense team.
Exactly. Public defenders may not have the time to really dig deep into every case. They might miss crucial details or not challenge evidence they should.
It's not always about a lawyer deliberately messing up. It's about them not having the tools to do their job properly.
Right. And this lack of adequate defense, it hits people who are already marginalized the hardest.
Okay, so we've talked about the systemic issues, but what about the actual evidence?
Yeah.
Forensic science is supposed to be objective, scientific, but we've seen that it can be flawed too.
Absolutely. We tend to think of forensic evidence as this, ultimate truth.
Yeah, like it's always right.
But it's not. It's only as good as the people handling it, the people analyzing it.
I mean, we talk about Crystal Voss and the shaken baby syndrome thing. Are there other examples of forensic techniques that have been, discredited?
Oh, yeah, tons. Bite mark analysis, for example, used to be seen as this foolproof way to connect a suspect to a crime.
And now
we know it's junk science. Same with microscopic hair comparison.
so even techniques that were considered the gold standard, they can be wrong.
Yep. Even fingerprint analysis, which is still useful, it's not perfect. There's always room for human error, especially when you add in pressure, bias, all that.
It's unsettling to think someone could be locked up based on evidence that's later proven unreliable. What's being done to fix this?
Well, the National Institute of Justice is pushing for stricter standards in labs, more research, more transparency. They're also investing in new technologies that are hopefully more objective and reliable.
So there's a recognition that things need to change.
Yeah, definitely. And it's an ongoing process. We need to keep pushing for more research, more scrutiny.
Because at the end of the day, people's lives are at stake.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the systemic issues, the flawed evidence, but what about the people who are actually exonerated? How do they rebuild their lives after going through something like that?
That's a big question, and it's something the sources we've looked at really delve into. A lot of exonerees face huge challenges when they get out. Financial struggles, psychological trauma, you name it.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to re-enter society after being wrongfully imprisoned. Where do you even begin?
It's tough. They've lost years of their lives, they missed out on opportunities, and then they have to deal with the stigma of having a criminal record.
It's like they're trying to fit back into a world that's moved on without them.
Exactly. And then on top of the practical stuff, there's the mental and emotional toll.
Right, we talked about the anger, the distrust, the fear.
Jason, from that Canadian study, he talked about how easily he gets angry now and how he panics in crowded places.
I remember that. He said grocery shopping was a nightmare.
These people have been through a trauma most of us can't even imagine.
So it's not just about clearing their name, it's about helping them heal.
Exactly. Exoneration is just the beginning of a long road to recovery.
This deep dive is really eye-opening. We've seen how these wrongful convictions happen, the factors that contribute to them, and the devastating impact they have.
We've covered a lot, but there's still more to discuss. In the last part of our deep dive, we'll look at the paths to exoneration and redress, the challenges and limitations of those processes, and what can be done to prevent these injustices from happening in the first place.
Okay, so we've talked about the causes, we've talked about the consequences, but now I want to focus on solutions, like what can actually be done to right these wrongs and, even better, prevent them from happening in the first place.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's not an easy one to answer. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We need to look at the system itself, but also at the bigger picture, like societal attitudes.
Right, because those attitudes, they shape the system, right?
Exactly. So let's start with the system. A lot of the sources we've looked at highlight the need for better forensic science.
Yeah, we talked about how some techniques have been totally debunked,
Mm-hmm.
and even the ones that are still considered valid, they're not foolproof.
Right. So the question becomes, how do we make sure the science we're using to put people behind bars is actually, good science?
Solid question.
Well, the National Institute of Justice, they've been advocating for stricter standards in labs, more research, more transparency. They're also funding the development of new technologies, trying to make the evidence more objective, more reliable.
Makes sense. We need to be using the best possible science, and we need to make sure the people handling that evidence, analyzing it, they're doing it right.
Absolutely. But it goes beyond that, too. It's about how that evidence is presented in court, how it's weighed.
Okay, so like educating judges and juries about the limitations of forensic science.
Exactly. We need them to understand that it's not always this clear-cut thing, like you see on TV.
Right, it's not a magic bullet.
Nope. So that's the forensic side of things. But we also need to address those systemic issues that lead to, like, tunnel vision and confirmation bias.
Okay, now that's a tough one. How do you change the way people think, especially when they're under pressure to solve a crime?
It's not easy, but there are things we can do. One idea is to implement blind procedures whenever possible.
Blind procedures.
So the person analyzing evidence or conducting a lineup, they don't know who the suspect is. It helps reduce the chance of unconscious bias.
Interesting. So you take away that temptation to see what you want to see.
Exactly. Another approach is to create a culture of, open inquiry within law enforcement agencies.
What do you mean by that?
Encouraging officers, investigators to question their own assumptions, to be open to other possibilities.
So basically teaching them to be more critical thinkers.
Right. And providing better training on cognitive biases, how to avoid them, how to consider all the evidence, not just the stuff that fits their initial theory.
Makes sense. But what about prosecutors? They have a lot of power in these cases.
You're right. Prosecutors, they need to be just as careful as anyone else when it comes to bias. Their job is justice, not just getting convictions.
Okay, so how do we make sure they're doing that?
Well, they need to be willing to drop charges if new evidence comes up that points to the defendant's innocence. They need to be open to different explanations, consider the possibility that mistakes were made.
I can see how that would be tough, especially in high-profile cases where there's a lot of public pressure.
It is, but it's crucial. The integrity of the whole system depends on prosecutors prioritizing truth and fairness, not just what's expedient or what'll look good in the press.
I agree. Okay, so we've talked about law enforcement, forensic science, prosecutors. What about defense attorneys? What role do they play in all this?
Access to good legal representation, that's fundamental. And we know public defenders, they're often stretched thin, overworked, underfunded. That can limit their ability to really do their job properly.
Right. That came up a lot in the research.
So we need to make sure they have the resources they need, more funding, obviously, but also we need to attract good lawyers to this field. Maybe loan forgiveness programs, things like that.
So everyone, regardless of how much money they have, can get a decent defense.
Exactly. A strong defense, that's essential to a fair trial. But, like I said, fixing the system is only part of it. We have to look at society as a whole.
Okay, so what are some of those societal factors that contribute to wrongful convictions?
Well, one big one is how the media portrays crime. We talked about how coverage can be sensationalized, focused on the shock value,
Yeah, it's all about ratings, right?
pretty much. And that creates this climate of fear, this desire for quick and easy justice. That makes it harder for jurors to be objective.
Right, they're already primed to believe the worst.
Exactly. So we need to be more media literate. We need to understand how bias can creep into reporting. We need to question the stories we're being
Be
told.
critical thinkers.
Yep. And we need to challenge those stereotypes and prejudices that can lead to wrongful convictions, like racial bias. We know that plays a huge role, especially in cases with Black defendants.
So we need to address systemic racism as a whole.
Absolutely. And we need to look at our own biases. We all have them, even if we don't realize it. But by recognizing them, we can start to mitigate their impact.
So basically be more self-aware.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about building a fairer, more just society. A society where everyone is treated equally, regardless of race, ethnicity, or anything else.
This deep dive has been a real journey. We've seen how these wrongful convictions happen, the factors that contribute to them, the devastating impact they have on people's lives.
But we've also seen that there's hope. There are people out there fighting for justice, working to exonerate the innocent and reform the system.
And we've learned that we all have a role to play, whether it's supporting organizations like the Innocence Project, pushing for policy changes, or just being more informed and engaged citizens.
It's about understanding that justice isn't a spectator sport. We have to participate. We have to fight for it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Mm.
And on that note, we leave you with this question. What will you do to ensure that justice is served, not just for some, but for all?